pleased to have today Dr. Basil Bibby, who's the recent winner of the ADA Gold Medal Award for Excellence in Dental Research. And I'd like to begin by just reading from an article that was written about Dr. Bibby, and it was written by Dr. Mandel in the ADA Journal. And I'm going to quote, "In an age dedicated to the perpetuation and worship of youth, it is a rarity to find an 84-year-old role model. But to the dental research community, Basil Bibby is just that, a model researcher, educator, and innovator." Welcome, Dr. Bibby.
Thank you.
That's
you can tell from that Irv Mandel's a friend of mine.
Well, and I'm sure that it's true. I'd like to sort of take us back in terms of how you got all of these accolades. Where did all this start?
Well, I got into research in the United States more or less by accident. I didn't come to the United States to do research. I came to do clinical dentistry. But the institution I landed at the University of Rochester, didn't have a significant clinical dentistry activity. But they did have well, they didn't have a dental research activity, but they had a very strong medical research activity. And the dean of the medical school had decided that something should be done to get research going in the biological sciences and dentistry. So he arranged to have money available for dentists who wanted to do research to come in and spend a year or two just to see how they made out. And that very tolerant attitude is how I got started and interested. Actually, my introduction to research in the United States was I went to see the dean on arrival. He took me upstairs to an empty laboratory and said, "This is where you'll work." I said, "What will I do?" He said, "Anything of interest to dentistry. Come and see me if you need help." Now, that was my research training.
Now, the dean's name was what? The dean?
Dean Whipple.
Whipple.
Subsequently won a Nobel Prize for his work on anemia. However, what he knew, and I certainly believe now, is if you put a susceptible person in the right atmosphere, they're likely to develop. Now, there were dozens of young medical graduates and medical students who had research laboratories. And when you went to lunch and sat with anybody, the conversation would be, "Nice day, isn't it?" Well, probably wasn't in Rochester, but nevertheless. What's your research project? And so if you weren't doing research, you became a sort of second-class citizen. And so I got going in research.
Now, start me a little bit earlier. This began in New Zealand.
Yes, my professional career was in New Zealand.
And that's where you went to dental school?
That's where I got my first dental degree, my only dental degree. Well, that's not right, my first dental degree, yes.
Right. So what prompted you to decide to leave New Zealand and come to the States?
Well, what happens, I was rather fond of words, and I rather liked writing. And I thought the world stood in need of the novel to end all novels. So I decided to take a few years tour of the world. And
write your novel?
A working tour. So being in the British Commonwealth at that time, every of the British Commonwealth countries, that included Canada and Ceylon and Hong Kong, and if you had a dental degree, you could practice dentistry. And I knew it was openings in Britain. The place where there didn't seem to be any support for a dentist was the United States. So I saw this announcement of these fellowships and wrote for them. This was to be my first year of travel. Oh. And then I was going to go on to other places.
Tell me about the novel.
Well, the novel is still there, but I've decided too many people have written novels in the meantime, and I haven't done I've done enough scientific writing, really, to cure any desire to write any extra. Scientific writing and romance writing are completely different. In one, you have to not leave any shades of doubt. if you're writing for the common reader, you've got to play a lot on suggestion. Offer words that he can put his own interpretation on. And they don't go together. And so 2 or 3 years of science writing cured me of desire to write any extra.
So the first stop on your world tour was coming to the States and starting this fellowship at Rochester. I'm curious, though, you mentioned that you were really interested in terms of clinical dentistry. What got you involved in dentistry in the first place?
Well, that's another one of those things. I think perhaps if there had been research opportunities in New Zealand in the field of chemistry, I very probably would have gone into chemistry. I had a little extra chemistry in high school, and but there wasn't. So what could I do which would have some scientific component, yet have a chance to deal with people? I wanted to have contact with people, and I considered medicine, and there was no problem of getting into medical school in those days in New Zealand. And what else? Well, law, well, I had something against that. And so finally, it was more or less reductio ad absurdum, and dentistry was there. It filled the opportunity to have a scientific outlet, a technical outlet, and also time to interest yourself in some social activities. Teaching's another thing I would have considered. But maybe coming from a fairly solid family with lots of aunts that had social ambitions, they thought I should do better than be just a teacher or something of that sort, which was bad advice, but nevertheless, I got into teaching anyhow. So,
now these aunts of yours, they suggested that dentistry would be a good.
No, they discouraged. Why don't you go into medicine?
I see.
Why don't you go into medicine? That's more distinguished and so forth.
Yes.
Maybe I wasn't susceptible to suggestion, but it didn't. I wanted the technical outlet, to be perfectly frank. Yeah. Actually, I had a brother in dentistry too. But he did not encourage me. He would have encouraged me to go to medicine. But well, I chose what I wanted, and as it turned out, it was a good choice. Because look back and looking at what's happened, the competition in dentistry for people with scientific interest and some ability is much less key than it is in medicine. If I'd gone into medicine, I would have been overshadowed by hundreds of bright boys. In dentistry, there wasn't as much competition. It was a little easier to be seen and to do something original. So I say it was a lucky choice. And while I've not done much technical dentistry, in fact, it's 50 years since I put in my last filling, I still enjoy the technical operation. I can still get satisfaction out of the feeling that came from just rounding off a edge of a filling or something of this sort. It's satisfactory. And as I see some of my former associates in dental practice who've maybe had a little bit of turn in research and then decided in dental practice, I can understand it. The satisfaction that comes from dealing with people, doing them a good turn and getting a technical outlet. I can understand why they desert research, but okay, that's their choice. I admire it.
What about your parents?
My parents? Well, one interesting aspect of my parents, New Zealand is not a very old country. My father was the first white child born in my particular area of the country. When he grew up, the Maori and native population far exceeded the white population. My mother went to New Zealand from Scotland and London to recover from bronchitis, to live with an uncle in the area, and this Scots girl met the New Zealand native and the beginning of the Bibby family, or that branch of it. Yeah.
Now, where in New Zealand is this? What part of New Zealand?
New Zealand, as you will recall, is two islands, a North Island and a South Island. And I was in the North Island on the east coast, about halfway up. The closest, well, they still put my old town on the map, but the closest town in maps nowadays would be Napier. It's a port on the middle of the east coast of New Zealand. It's a very favored part of New Zealand. Actually, we know, and I know from some experience, we get more ultraviolet light and radiation from the sun than almost anywhere in the world.
Oh,
and I had a reaction to it up there one time.
Now, what did your father do?
My father, well, you go back to my grandfather.
Okay.
He was a veteran of the Crimean War and a bit of a wanderer. And he set out to California to seek gold, and in Australia. Before he got to Australia, he thought he'd go to New Zealand. He wanted to do it his own way. He never found gold in New Zealand. But he also met a girl from Lancashire, and they married, and she anchored him by making him buy land and take up a store. And so my father inherited the family farm with three brothers. And so they were a group running these operations together till they severed in various ways. And so my father, when he retired, he had handed over the farm to my brothers, and he was running a store.
So nobody was surprised when you decided to do this world tour, and given your grandfather's tendency to wander a little bit.
Well, it could be some relation, could be some connection there, yeah.
How did you pick Rochester out of this whole country?
Well, I hate to say this, for anyone in Rochester should hear it.
Everybody in Rochester is going to hear this.
Well, I actually wrote to Harvard. They referred my letter to Rochester. I got a letter from Rochester offering me, I wrote one letter saying what I'd like to do, offering me the fellowship there. I got in the train in Buffalo on the way. I came across train days in Buffalo. I hadn't even looked at the map yet to see where Rochester was. I no sooner settled down and they called Rochester, and I jumped out in the middle of the night to find a place to stay. And so, but Rochester had this idea of giving dentists a chance to show where they could do research. Dean Whipple took an attitude rather different from medical educators of the time. The general idea in medical schools was that dentists have no scientific interest. Whipple was independent in many ways, and he had the idea that dentists could be intelligent, and given a good opportunity, they would develop like anybody else. And his experiment proved it. People you name, you know, such as Volker, such as Maynard Hine, myself, Sognus, actually I think 7 or 8 of the past presidents of the International Association of Dental Research were fellows that came to Rochester under the same sort of arrangement as I did, but with rather more definite ideas of what they wanted to do.
Tell me what was in this letter that you wrote to Harvard that was referred to Rochester.
Well, as I said, I wanted an excuse to get a salary in the United States. And I wrote to Harvard, and I apparently misread or someone misprinted that these fellowships were available at Harvard.
Oh, I see.
So I wrote to Harvard. They referred the letter both to Yale and to Rochester, which had training grants with Rockefeller money for dentists. And I got encouraging letters from both places. And the reason for it was that dentists just weren't interested in that sort of opportunity. I can offer evidence of that. When I moved into the senior position at the School of Medicine and Dentistry, where these fellowships were, and I started to look over the files, my letter was there. And across the top of it was written, "We know nothing about this man. Tell him to come anyhow." I mean, that's how desperate they were to find dentists who might possibly turn out right.
Now, this was in what year? 1934, I think?
That was, I came to the United States in 1930.
1930.
August or September 1930. Another thing that struck me in Rochester was New Zealand has many trees. They're mainly evergreen trees, though. And I had never seen the full colors of fall. And Rochester, at that time, before the elm trees all died, was very spectacular in the fall. And I decided I'd stay around through one more fall before I moved on. And before that fall came, they'd snared me into a responsible position in Rochester.
Well, tell me about this room that Whipple took you to. He showed you this empty room and he said, okay, do something interesting.
Yeah. Well, that's what it was. The medical graduate next door had a lot of time. We'd talk about things, and I decided I'd set up an experiment. I had written a thesis in New Zealand for a higher dental degree, which dealt with these brown deposits that form on the teeth. And so I was a little interested in the accumulations on the teeth. And I think the first experiment I set up dealt with the formation of salivary calculus. And the reason for that, and I hadn't thought of it this way, that Dean Whipple had a group of dogs, which were very important dogs, and that's where the use of blood of liver extracts to cure anemia work was done on this group of dogs.
Oh, I see.
And he had a trouble with calculus on the dogs, and he probably dropped the suggestion, what form is calculus, or something of that sort. So my first experiment was on that. Yeah.
And so you began by looking at the calculus on dogs' teeth.
Yeah. Well, we looked at dogs' teeth and took the calculus off, but it wasn't the same thing as you got off human teeth. So I set up an experiment on the basis of the information that was available, that given reasons for the formation of the calculus that appeared in several journals. One was the loss of the carbon dioxide tension, the calcium and salt precipitation. The other was the organic material deteriorating and the calcium depositing. The other was bacteria growing on the tooth surface and snaring the deposits. And so I set up test tube experiments in which we used carbon dioxide pressures, antibacterial agents, and so forth to see. And the conclusion was that both the loss of carbon dioxide tension and the bacteria were necessary to make the calculus grow. So no one's disproved that yet.
Tell me about your relationship with Whipple.
Well, I'd have to say I'm certainly greatly indebted to him. I would say it was a very happy one. He was very good to me as New Zealand. I think I was a disappointment to him because he was a hunter and a fisherman, and he knew about fishing in New Zealand, and I hadn't fished seriously in New Zealand. I didn't like to go hunting with him, but he had me out to his home and out to family picnics and so forth, and was very broad-minded. His general approach was go down and suggest something. He'd say, yes. Do you know whether it'll work? No. Well, why don't you try? And so he perpetually let me, or other people, particularly me because I was early in the group, just go where we wanted to. In other words, he wanted to just see what we could do and gave us complete freedom of action almost within rather rigid financial limits. I mean, he
wasn't spending a lot of money on you.
Well, he didn't spend too much on me, but I'll tell you how generous he was. I talked of leaving because I didn't have a dental degree in the United States, and I could see I'd never get into the mainstream of dental education in the United States. So he said, why don't you get a dental degree? I said, time and money. He said, you look into the opportunities, and so I wrote to a few dental schools to see whether under what conditions I could earn a dental degree. I finally found one, Tufts, which thought that if I worked part-time on research and they could tie in the earning of a dental degree. And so he kept me in my full salary position with half-time leave to go to Boston and work off this dental degree. And so that's how I got a dental degree in Rochester. Well, actually before that, when I talked of leaving, he said, why don't you get why don't you work for a PhD degree? I said I had no real interest in it. He said, why don't you do it? It's sort of useful. Might be useful to you. I said, why don't you go and talk to the graduate dean? So I went to see the graduate dean. He said, yes, we've talked about this. Faculty thinks you're doing good research, and we'd like to put the seal of the institution on people who are doing good research. Now, let's see what you've done, how we can arrange a PhD. So I expect I should declare it public. I got a semi-honorable PhD, semi-honorary one, and a quarter honorary one for a DMD. And of course that fit in with my bias, that the grades and degrees and examinations don't mean too much. The names are useful sometimes. Yeah.
How long had you been at Rochester before you went to Tufts?
1930 to 1940.
So you were there 10 years.
Well, actually, that's not quite right. It was 1930 to 36 or 37. See, I came on a student visa, and after a while you got to get out of the country. So I had to go back to New Zealand to renew my entry papers.
I see.
And so actually they couldn't squeeze me in from New Zealand, so I squeezed in from Britain.
I see.
Because as a New Zealander, I was a British subject.
Right. And when you went to dental school to get your dental degree, was it Whipple's expectation that you were going to then return to Rochester?
Well, the arrangement we had, I spent 3 months in Boston and 3 months at home.
I see.
Still long distance coordinating rather than supervising the dental activities in Rochester.
And then what happened once you got your degree at Tufts?
Well, I mustn't sabotage Tufts. They were very good to me. They said, you know what you need as well as we do. We want you to see if you can get some research started at Tufts. And you just take what courses you want and what clinical exercises you want, and we'll find the people to help you.
I see.
So that put me to work putting in gold foils and things like that, and listening to lectures. And so it worked out fairly well. One of my first research associates in Tufts was Irving Glickman, who constantly made a name in periodontology. I'm proud of the fact I got him started in research.
And after you completed your degree at Tufts, did you go back to Rochester then?
Well, I see, I had never left Rochester.
Well, yeah, that's true.
I was still fully on Rochester,
right, yes.
Of course, the amusing thing was actually that before I had actually received the degree, the president of the university came down to see me and said, you know, Dr. Bibby...
this is the president of Tufts now.
Yeah, you know, we're losing the dean here next year. And I said, that's interesting. He said, would you be interested? Oh, I said I was prepared to consider it. So actually, I'm a rather rare dean who was actually given the deanship of the school before he had graduated. Or at least nominated for it.
That's right, the first dental student.
Yeah. In other words, I've been lucky. Things. The important, as I just tell many of my graduate students, the important thing getting on in life is to be waiting at the right place at the right time. And I happen to be waiting at the right place at the right time a number of times.
And to be open to the opportunities.
Should be self-confident enough to tackle it. And I haven't suffered too much for lack of that.
So when you completed your degree at Tufts, you then became dean of the dental school.
Well, I'm a little hazy, but there was, I think, a 5-month interim between going back and winding up things in Rochester and the vacancy appearing in Tufts.
How did you like being a dean?
I rather enjoyed it. I think we accomplished a good deal. And again, I was lucky. Tufts was in need of a slightly different point of view, and they had a core of the faculty there that wanted to get some research going. And the one thing that was very valuable about Tufts, they had a very loyal alumni body. And I think of almost any other school in the country, I know at least one. If they had brought in an outsider who wasn't a faculty member or something of this sort, there would have been a riot amongst the alumni. But they took it very calmly, and while we had some amusing differences of opinion with some of them, they were very loyal, and in fact, I can't say I regret leaving, but I have great doubts about leaving because it was very satisfactory. New England, Tufts being a center of New England dentistry at that time, to go to any small town in New England and see there's one of the boys I knew as a student. If you care to drop in his office, he's always glad to see you, and it was a lot of fun. You know, I enjoy the personal contact. Yeah.
I want to ask you something about your philosophy of dental education, and it comes once again from this article that Dr. Mandel wrote, and it's talking about you now. This juxtaposition of research and education was not an accident. For all of his professional life, they were intimately entwined. And then it goes on to say something that you wrote in a paper in 1938 on social value of dental education, and it says, he discussed the methods of advancing dentistry. He was concerned that many schools had become temples devoted to the perpetuation of rituals and the worship of graven images of golden amalgam.
I plead guilty.
How did that fit with your Tufts experience?
I wasn't talking about Tufts at that time, because if anything, I can say out of full respect to Tufts, Tufts had gone a little too far in thinking that dentistry could be done by medical magic, shall we say. And one or two of the clinical instructors emphasized the biological importance of dentistry almost to the point of belittling clinical perfection. And so I brought in people who were, well, unfortunately I was able to find some who had a strong desire to improve the clinical level of things, the technical aspect of things, as well as to give a scientific or intellectual challenge to it. So what I felt was needed in dentistry was an intellectual, be technically expert, enjoy it, love it, but know why you're doing it. Don't say it because that's what the journal said last month or so forth. Be able to explain it and to build that intellectual content to support what you're doing in dentistry seemed to be what I wanted to do.
How well do you feel you've done it at doing that at Tufts and then later at Eastman?
Well, I would say I've been pretty consistent on that. Although things get away from me, you know. I was pretty good on amalgam. In fact, I thought I was rather whiz at it. But when it got to some of these more elaborate procedures and so forth, I had to bow down to new knowledge. In other words, I was not in a position, though I tried, to change the philosophy of the orthodontists. And so at a certain point, perhaps after you've had your fingers burned a few times, you learn to let the experts expert
Yeah.
where they want to.
I'm thinking about your role as an administrator now,
Yeah.
in terms of trying to build together this intellectual piece and the technical excellence.
Well, here again, in my opinion, I think this. I expect it's important you have some ability to demonstrate what you mean. Mm-hmm. And I was able to find one or two associates and to put something in myself, so we could have people who had a fairly broad interest in the world in general, in some aspects of dentistry particularly, and the scientific background.
Mm-hmm. Who were some of those people?
Well, I think of Dr. Brudevold.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the people out with me more was Dr. Horse. He's not with us, and Dr. Septelny, who's still there. Well, a rotation of people who were there just temporarily in Australia and various parts of the world now, but they were sharp boys who liked the opportunity and gave back, were prepared to talk back, shall we say. Yeah.
How well do you think we're doing in dentistry now in terms of building that intellectual component into our technical quality?
Well, I'm still go with Dean Whipple. There's nothing wrong with dentistry. If a man has good brains when he goes in dentistry, he's got good brains when he dies. It's a question where he's going to use them. Now, natural thing is to become a technical expert. But as I've moved and met many deans and trustees of the ADA and so forth, my impression of the intellectual contents of dentistry has not gone down, it's gone up. Because while some of these successful practitioners or expert politicians in ADA and other places don't have too much in common. Most have got the desire to do what they're doing and do it well and to sacrifice something to do it. And damn it, you can't do much better than that in life. To be able to give up something for the sake of being interested in something. And as far as I'm concerned, that makes life worth living.
Yes, yes. I'd like to go back now to the time after you left Tufts and returned to Eastman, and I'd like you to talk maybe just for a little while about where your research interests were going at that time.
The Eastman Dental Center, the Rochester Dental Dispensary was called at that time, had fallen on some lean years before I came back. There's a complex history of the Eastman Dental Center, or dental dispensary, at one time was supposed to serve as the clinical wing of the School of Medicine and Dentistry of the University of Rochester, in the same way as the Strong Memorial Hospital served as the clinical wing for the medical graduates. And the dean of the medical school and the director of the the dispensary could not see eye to eye on how it should go. And they got into, let's say, use a carefully chosen disagreements on most things, and neither one of them, one didn't trust the other. And so I was brought back, and the trustees of the Eastman at that time, most of whom were also trustees of the University of Rochester, the only instructions they gave me was get some research going and work out, repair the relationships between Eastman and the university.
I see. And
so that left me with a pretty open field.
Sounds like that empty room again.
Yeah. And so I could do research on anything. They wanted some research, get research on anything. Actually, the thing that I actually spent more on, invested more people on anything else, was on the development of new restorative filling materials. Before I accepted the deanship of Tufts, I made a talk in Boston saying that I thought that it's time that we made a new break in restorative materials, and the new plastic age was coming, and we should get in and see what would be done there. Well, I was roundly taken to task by the Dean of Harvard Medical School at the time, Laurie Minor, who was very active in the support of the National Institutes of Health. I made a rather tactless remark, I think, in saying I thought perhaps the efforts of the American Dental Association better spent if they looked for new materials rather than trying to improve old type of materials. And so that was my, and I had 6 different people appointed to look into the restorative materials. It wasn't until a long time after at Tufts that Dr. Bonacore finally made a breakthrough. And we were opposed, interesting enough, not opposed, discouraged by the Bureau of Standards and everybody else. But I've been in the fortunate position that of being able to do pretty much what I wanted to and not be too dependent upon an outside jury. And I'll admit that I've been just very lucky.
This may be a good time for us to take just a short break.
Yeah.
And then when we come back, what I'd like to do is talk to you a little bit about fluoride.
Yeah, okay.
And also talk about some of the people that you influenced.
Yeah.
Okay?
Well, I've survived so far, I think.
Oh, yes, you're doing just grand. Dr. Bibby, I'm fascinated with the story of Bonacore and the restorative materials. Who were some of the other people that you had an opportunity to work with?
You don't mean in the restorative materials?
No, in research and in teaching.
In research. Well, it's quite a long list, actually.
Who are some of your favorites?
The ones that are most distinguished have gone further, shall we say. First upon those would be Dr. Joe Volker, who followed me as Dean of Tufts, then became President and finally Chancellor of the University of Alabama, developed a very strong medical center there, but unfortunately just 3 weeks ago died.
Yes,
but after a long illness. Dr. Volker, who became Dr. Sognas, who became Dean of the University of California. Also Bob Caldwell, who became Dean of the university there.
Now, all of these had been fellows at Rochester?
Yes. One that we didn't mention, his predecessor, is Dr. Maynard Hine. He was only there for a short period, but he worked closely with me.
I see.
And well, I didn't learn from him as much as I should have. In retrospect, what I should have learned from him was to disagree a little more tactfully than I used to do. I think I've learned a little tact since then, but he was very good at adjudicating, and that went on, and I served him in many positions, President of the ADA, Chancellor of University of Indiana, and so forth. So I am rather proud of the fact that I think it was more than 100 of my graduate students who are professors or associate professors in universities throughout the world.
Is that right?
7 in one dental school in London, 7 in one dental school in Australia, 5 in one dental school in Denmark, and let alone places like Iran, Kenya.
Well, you've had an influence on a lot of people.
I like to think I've given opportunity to a lot of people, and I think that's the important thing. In other words, give young men a chance, or young women a chance, to show what they can do. Encourage them rather than put them in a mold. Now, I am suspicious of this modern high-tech research that's getting most of the money in dental research these days, because to put it in blunt terms, I think you're taking good men and making them wet nurses to complicated apparatus and not getting a chance to think. I like the statement of the former director of the Rockefeller Foundation for Medical Research, whom I had the good fortune to know, who said that in his opinion, the critical ability of research workers was inversely proportional to the complexity of the apparatus they were using. In other words, the more complex the apparatus, the more they think they don't have to do the thinking, it's going to do it for them. And I apply that to some extent, in a very minority position, to statistical analysis. We won't go further on that, because I'm a minority, let's put it that way.
Just give me a couple of sentences about statistical analysis.
What, a couple of sentences?
Yes, I mean about your minority position.
Well, essentially, I think people try to do the thinking for them. They think that if they get a big enough display of mathematics, no one's going to question them. And that is unfortunately the case. It's definitely the case in my own field of fluoride research, in which I can think of at least 2 procedures which were adopted, I believe, I can't prove this, because of the mathematical display rather than the soundness of the material. In other words, used questionable mixtures, got fine mathematics. And in the innocent days of dentistry, we're not so innocent now, we had to accept that.
I'd like to turn a little bit now from...
You better get off that one.
Yes, okay. We'll get the statisticians in here. I'd like to move off that and move from the people that you've had an impact on or have influenced to talk a little bit about the people that have influenced you.
Well, I expect if I go back to my dental school experience, the dean of the dental school I went to was Dr. Pickerel. He was an Englishman who came out, founded a dental school in New Zealand, and while he was there, wrote a couple of books and did quite high-class research. And some of his work still stands. Then I expect we have to put the... Well, of course, I had 5 brothers and 1 sister, and I was the bottom end of the family.
You were the youngest.
Yeah, and you learn to
adapt,
talk yourself out of difficult situations and adapt. And I think that undoubtedly is very important. I'd have to add to that, of course, my own parental example and firm religious beliefs. It gave me a feeling that you didn't have to live for yourself alone. And I'm very grateful, and I've found it since the satisfaction and support. First, of course, in my post-doctoral career, we'd have to put Dean Whipple in there, because his example of giving people a chance to show what they've got and providing with the opportunities of not making them a sign on the dotted line for everything they did. In other words, loose administration, for which he was criticized and for which I've been criticized, but which I think it in human values, it's worth more than beautiful organization. Then, of course, to a lesser degree, the people I've worked with that have had certain abilities, to a greater extent than you have. I mentioned Maynard Hine already, and also it's true in the reverse, that had abilities, had habits that were worth avoiding. But I mean, I'd have to say the top man would be definitely Dean Whipple. Yeah. And some of the professors at Rochester, one of the early professors in bacteriology who actually shared with Dean Whipple the promotion of the dental training program in Rochester, Dr. Stanhope Bain Jones. When I came to Rochester, and this is perhaps an example of the way that I like to think they snared me in dental research, is that I got there, and I'd only been there a month or so, when Dr. Bain Jones, who at that time was secretary of something of the Medical Research Council, would bring me down a research application and say, look this over, and tell me what you think of it. Well, it had saliva or tooth or mouth mentioned into it. And in other words, they put responsibility on me. And before I was dry behind the ears, I was accepting, giving opinions on things, and part of development. And I feel the same way, that if people are given a chance to plan their own research and make their mistakes, the privilege of making mistakes is very important. So.
Well, that's interesting. I'm wondering where the influence came to direct your research to fluoride.
Well, that just happened. We had 7 or 8 dental trainees at Rochester, research trainees at Rochester at that time. I had evolved into a senior position, and we worked very much as a group. And we had sort of decided that we would look at various aspects of the dental caries program. And they consisted of the structure of the tooth, the bacterial activity on the outside, the food, plaque formation, original changes in enamel surface, the physical structure of the teeth. And so when the fluoride question came up, it was natural to say, which of these things is it working on? And so, in about 4 or 5 different people, I got to work, for instance, to see what fluoride effect had on the bacterial acid formation. Turned out it had some, but not on bacterial growth. Someone else got to say, it's fluoride, what's going on with this fluoride? What's happening to the enamel structure as such? What's its effect on solubility? Well, when these results started coming in, what does it do to animal caries? All of which we had experiments going pre-fluoride in related areas. It turned out they pointed to the fact that something was going on there which wasn't what was originally assumed. It wasn't either an antibacterial action, or it wasn't a matter of something that only happened during the formation of the teeth. Because Dr. Sognas, whose name I mentioned, he made a very acute appliance and put a retainer on one side of rat's teeth, put fluoride applications on there, kept the other side dry, and sure enough, he got less dental decay on the side the fluoride was painted on. Although, since he had nutrition in his blood, he never believed his results. And so that all worked out to the facts. And then Dr. Volker and I analyzed literature, and we saw evidence in literature that the fluoride wasn't working only during the first 8 years of life, which was preached at the time. It was working at later periods as well. So that all gave rise to the idea that, well, Dr. Volker's critical experiments are showing that he could change the solubility of enamel in acid by immersing it in fluoride.
I see.
So all those led to the idea that fluoride applied to the tooth surface would reduce the enamel solubility and thereby could prevent dental decay. And I happened to take on personally, after I went to Boston, making the applications in children. And sure enough, they produce a significant reduction of dental decay.
Now, where did the fluoride in the toothpaste begin? Was that an area that you worked on at all?
That was all part of the follow-up. Once we found the effect, dentifrice companies and others got on the job, and I used mixtures of dentifrice mixtures for more than one dental manufacturer, which didn't work.
Did not work.
Did not work. And we found out subsequently a mouthwash which didn't work, but other things that did work. In other words, applying it to the teeth did, putting in a prophylactic mixture did, putting it in a gel and putting it on the teeth did, giving it in pills didn't, sucking in the mouth did, and so we came up with a pretty comprehensive idea of how fluoride was working. And then work elsewhere. I'm thinking particularly of some work in England showing that fluoride taken between the age of 5 and 6 presented decay in first molars, but taken through the years 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, 1, 2, 3, and 4, had no effect on caries in the first molars. That separated. And other reports came in. We still lack a comprehensive review of all that material. Someone other than me should write it.
What you're saying is that we're lacking a comprehensive review of the effects of fluoride?
Well, no, the effects I think are pretty well known, but what's attracting research now is the fundamental mechanism. Is when your fluoride is reacting with the tooth, what is it? Is it a deposit of calcium fluoride on the tooth first? Does it change the other types of phosphates there? All of which is fine science, but it's not going to affect, as far as I see, the utility of fluoride in dentistry. And finding that the local effect of fluoride works can also explain what happens with water fluoridation. The studies, well, I think one I think of first is one in Brantford, Canada, in which they showed that children who started using fluoride at the age of 9, see, after the incisors had all formed, had 60% less dental decay than those that didn't use fluoride. In other words, the teeth had been in the mouth. Newberg shows somewhat the same thing. In other words, it still acted on the teeth after they had come in, after they fully formed in the mouth. And all that made a pretty complete case that the actual mechanism, probably the main mechanism, still is, in my belief, reactions with the enamel. Now, that doesn't mean there's not some other effects on acid formation by bacteria, and those things can still play a part. But I think there's one. If I had, then this went a little further. It happened at Rochester. It was one of the early areas for work with radioactivity. Rochester had one of the first cyclotrons in the country, and being a small university, we knew one another pretty well. And so we were able to get the men running the cyclotron to make us radioactive fluoride. And with that, we were able to test absorption. When they put fluoride, where did it go? How much came through the body? How much went to the bone? I remember my part of that experiment was to clean out the intestines of the cats and see how much was still in the intestines. But it showed that the fluoride was not going through what up to that time had been accepted channels.
I see.
It also showed another very important thing, that if you had a sound tooth and put it in a fluoride mixture, it didn't have as much effect on changing solubility as if you ground the surface off the tooth and then put it in, or if you etched it in acid and then put it in. In other words, indicating, and this was shown by subsequent experiments, that the natural food's tooth surface picked up fluoride during life, and it got to a point where it wasn't so reactive. But if you took the surface off and explained a fresh reactive surface, then fluoride would react. Now, the logical deduction we drew from that was that fluoride is going to be most effective at the time the enamel is being etched, as in caries. In other words, that the most effective time for fluoride is during or immediately after a caries attack.
I see.
And this leads to something I have not preached, I've mentioned many times. I believe that a good deal could be accomplished by adding fluoride to sugar and to flour, which I regard as the two main causes of caries. And I think, moreover, that would be of great value in some of the undeveloped countries where there are no water supply, or no significant number of water supplies, and only limited sources of imported flour or sugar. I think I'd like to see someone get after that.
Yes. You mentioned just a while ago that an area that you felt needed to be done was a comprehensive review. And I was just sort of wondering what that comprehensive review would entail.
Well, obviously we can tell my ideas.
Yes.
That'd make it a good review. No, it seems to me there's a lot of concentrated discussion of the changes in the mineral, or the changes in the bacteria, or the changes, but to have it brought together,
pull it all together,
coordinated, and try to evaluate one part plus the other.
What?
Actually, as you might know, there was just recently been a conference sponsored by the National Institutes of Health. It took place in Georgia early this summer that was more or less directed towards that. But I didn't attend it. But that becomes the viewpoint, instead of being a coordinated view, becomes a viewpoint of 30 different lecturers. In other words, it's not a...
Not pulled together.
Yeah, a monograph is perhaps what's needed.
I'm curious, if you were to have the opportunity now to give the same kind of speech that you gave in Boston, which directed people towards new restorative materials, where would you direct them now? What are the burning questions now, and where would you direct dental research?
Well, obviously, where we need more information is on taking care of the periodontal tissues. There's a lot going on there, and I don't have sufficient acquaintance with it to point out what I think is a point of weakness, although I do have one of the things I've made some effort to start. And it hasn't, to my knowledge, been taken up as thoroughly as it should, would be going back to a clinical correlation of medical biology, can we call it, a relation of all types of diseases to periodontal disease. And I believe that the oral tissues could probably be demonstrated to be very fine indicators of the responsiveness of other tissues throughout the body. And I can visualize fine relations being worked out between a patch test inside the mouth, shall we say, and deficiencies of mucosal reactions elsewhere in the body. But this is all hypothetical. I mean, I'm not up in the details of it, but it's been one of my neglected babies, shall we say, to get something going in that area.
Well, you've got plenty of time.
Yeah, a lot of orphans in the world.
What does Dr. Bibby do when he's not working?
Oh, well, what's work? Work is doing what you don't want to do. So I can say I've never really worked, because I've enjoyed what I've been doing. And that work's what you're paid to do, which you wouldn't otherwise be doing. So I'm still physically active. I quite like old-fashioned pursuits like mowing lawns and pulling weeds. I grow now only a modest vegetable patch, but I used to grow an extensive one. But my tomatoes are a credit to me right now.
Is that right? They're looking good.
They're beautiful, no question about it. And the flowers are not so good. I'm interested in, well, some sports. The ones I enjoy most I haven't played to my satisfaction. I was an early cricket player and an early rugby football player, which I was relatively capable. And I don't get a chance to see or participate in those, but I enjoy baseball and other games, but you don't have quite the same feeling when you know what it feels like to have that ball in your arms and see the opening and get there through it or not get through it. I mean, when I see a fellow with an opportunity running for the goal, and you know, sometimes he doesn't know what to do. He does it wrong. And so that I can see how people who have played can have that feeling about baseball. I mean, I can't appreciate whether it should have been a double play opportunity or not, as far as baseball is concerned.
It's different with rugby.
Tennis, I was moderately. I played tennis until just a few years ago.
Did you?
In fact, I retired. I thought a suitable time to retire with the same time as Borg retired, because I mean I had to make an occasion of it. So we gave up tennis the same year, the same day actually.
Yes, did you?
Yeah. I announced my retirement. No, it was. I was playing with a senior group, and I was aware of the fact after a while that when I put a good shot back, my partner or the opposition would say, instead of expecting it, they would say, a good shot. In other words, I was surprising them because I was still playing a shot. I decided they were getting up and I was going down.
Yes.
Yeah. And so I got out in time, I think.
Oh, goodness. I'm curious, as you look back, you know, on your career and your activities, whether or not there was anything that you would have done differently.
What would I have done differently? Well, obviously I've done things, small things, but you know, human mind is what keeps us sane. Is justifying the things we did, and I obviously made mistakes, but I have the sort of mind that can blot those out fairly quickly, and you know, I can think of appointments I made that I would not have made, and appointments that I should have made, and judgments, decisions I made which weren't really so good. But I mean, you know, you probably, I won't say that, most people have the ability to blot out their mistakes by considering their successes. And I've got that to quite an ample degree, I suppose. Yes. Maybe more than average, maybe more than I should have. But.
Okay, then let's take the other side of it then. Let's look back and say, if you had to pick the three things that you were most proud of, what would they be?
Well, I would say, broadly speaking, the opportunity I've given for a number of young men to show their abilities. And I'm not limiting that to research. I mean in administration or clinical elsewhere. The fact that I was able to breathe life into one or two different institutions, the research program at Rochester, Tufts, and the Eastman Dental Dispensary. I expect I've got to be proud of my family and the daughter I ate lunch with today.
Yes.
I mean, they certainly have no regrets about that, and I can even go down to some grandchildren.
Yes.
Be rather proud of them too. But I can't claim much credit for that.
No.
Yeah.
I
I have to. Sometimes I think that maybe it was a mistake to leave New Zealand. They have a nice climate and lots of sunshine and lots of nice beaches. Maybe I could have led a prosperous, relaxed life there. But I mean, I've had my times of worry, but I always had the satisfaction of having a solid family behind me. And when I came to the United States and not intending to stay, I could take a gamble in starting in the States or starting somewhere else, knowing that I had a family that would, if need be, would send me the fare home and give me a crust for a year or two after I got back there. And those things are important.
Yes, yes.
I haven't answered your question, I know.
Oh, no, you have. It's interesting. In some way, when you talked about your accomplishments, it sounds a little bit like Dr. Whipple.
Oh, undoubtedly, undoubtedly. And I would say I'm proud of the fact that I believe I've been able to hand on his attitude to more than one institution. Yes. And it's interesting to go back on how do Whipple get that way. William Welsh was the first full-time professor in the sciences in American medical schools, the Johns Hopkins Professor of Pathology. Welsh, who's a pathologist, used to give his students or his graduates opportunity to work in his laboratory more or less on what they wanted to work on. Dean Whipple was one of his students. Bain Jones, who I mentioned, the Winternitzers, who was Dean of Harvard, Vanderbilt, the key men in the leading medical schools in the country were Welsh's students.
Oh, my.
Now, I think Whipple handed on his approach to me. I think I handed it on to Joe Volcker and Caldwell and a few others. So, in other words, let's have confidence in the youth, give them a chance. And I expect to be proud of anything else. I've kept a sense of thinking human values are perhaps more important than other things. You know, that's a good rule of life.
It certainly is.
Okay. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank
good.
you.